here, WHIP, Philly's #1 college radio station. My next guest needs no introduction whatsoever. He is a legend in the sportscasting industry, and that is the great Marv Albert. Marv, Zach Gelb here, WHIP Radio in Philadelphia. Thank you so much for joining me, and how are you today?
Zach, I am just fine, although you may be a bit confused.
Well, that definitely isn't Marv Albert. By the way, it's sportscasting legend Bob Costas, and if anyone doesn't know what I'm talking about, that is from the great Walter Cronkite speech that he gave when he was accepting that award. So, Bob, thanks so much for joining us today. Zach Gelb here, WHIP Radio in Philadelphia. How are you?
Zach, let me ask you something.
Yes.
Why would anyone listening to WHIP be familiar with my acceptance speech at the Walter Cronkite Awards in Arizona?
To be honest, because you're a legend in this industry, it all started for you at KMOX. You've done Olympics, horse racing, MLB Network, NBC, Football Night in America, and everyone who matter who you ask, they know who Bob Costas is.
Except, evidently, the people which led to the story at the Cronkite Award, who every now and then say, "Nice to see you, Marv," or "How you doing, Mr. Musburger," etc., etc.
Well, to me, I actually won an award at Comac High School because I'm a Comac alum just like yourself, and I was actually very confused as to why the award wasn't named the Bob Costas Award in Excellence of Communications instead of the Comac High School Excellence in Communications Award. Do you have any explanation for that?
I have absolutely no explanation. Why isn't it named the Rosie O'Donnell Award? She went to the same high school.
That's a great point as well. Well, take me back to your time at Comac High School. What were some memories that you have about that place?
I was just trying not to get beat up on a day-to-day basis and to get out and get to college, and I made it through unscathed.
And obviously you went to Syracuse University, as we're talking to the great Bob Costas. And Bob, as a kid growing up in New York, and I know we're in the Philadelphia airways right now, I always heard Mike and the Mad Dog growing up as a kid, and you were a perfectionist as both behind the mic as a talk show host and a play-by-play man. In your lifetime and in all the years you've been listening as a kid or even now in your career, who were the best play-by-play man that you've ever heard, and who was the best talk show host that you've ever heard?
Well, it's all subjective, and I would leave people out. But certainly no one's ever done baseball as close to perfection as Vin Scully. I don't think there's ever been a better all-round play-by-play man than Al Michaels. In his prime, Dick Enberg was extraordinarily versatile. He had tremendous professionalism, a dramatic voice, but also boyish enthusiasm. There was something that Jim McKay brought to a combination of play-by-play and hosting. He was literate, he had a wide frame of reference, but he also had a sense of drama, and he was enthusiastic, and there was something human about him, simultaneously journalistic, but also a fan. If you can pull those things off, which is a difficult thing to do, he was able to do that. I liked the work of Jack Whitaker. He was an excellent essayist. There are so many people out there, though, that are at present and in the past. I'm leaving people out. A long list of very worthy people out, but those are a few who stand out to me.
And how about from the talk show side of things?
Well, the whole genre has changed quite a bit. I've always liked people who can do in-depth interviews and aren't necessarily looking for heat, but they're looking more for light than for heat. And I don't know that I can pick any one person, but anyone who is more concerned with content than controversy for its own sake generally has my attention.
And the beauty of this job, and I don't really look at it as work because you have so much fun in this. I could come to WHIP.
And also because since it's a college station, they don't pay you, so you shouldn't look at it as work.
Well, I was down there on Radio Row in New Orleans, and it was absolutely phenomenal. And that was my 4th Radio Row, actually. And I'm interacting with all these athletes, and it's an absolute thrill to me, and it's exuberant. But you've done this for a plethora of years. I'm just curious. I know you were at Stan the Man's funeral, and you read a speech at his passing. But who was the best athlete that you ever interacted with during your time in this industry?
Well, there's a difference between all-round athlete and excellence in a particular sport. I always thought that Willie Mays was the best all-round baseball player I ever saw, but Willie's career was over by the time I started broadcasting games. So probably the best team sport athlete by a narrow margin among those that I've covered would be Michael Jordan. But, you Magic Johnson was not that far behind. Larry Bird at his best was not that far behind. If we're just talking about basketball and the excellence of someone like Tom Brady in the NFL and others, it gets to a point where you have a short list and you know who's on the short list, and after that you can make a case, a pretty good case for any one of them.
We're talking to the legendary Bob Costas, who joins us right here on WHIP, Philly's #1 college radio station. Zach Gelb here with you. And Bob, I understand that you did interview Jerry Sandusky. I watched that, and it was incredible what you got out of him. And we've seen everything that's come out this week from the Paterno family and the Free Report. My take on this, and I've been very loquacious about this subject, Sandusky is the ultimate animal of the earth. You could use every bad word to describe him. And then you look at the guys that covered it up, whether it was Paterno, Curley, Scholes, or Spanier, the fact that they put football in front of children being sexually abused, it's just an embarrassment. After reading the Paterno family report and the Free Report, when I mention the name Joe Paterno, what comes to mind when you're looking at this whole investigation?
Well, you stated flatly, Zach, that the four people you mentioned covered it up and put football ahead of the interests and well-being of innocent children. The Paterno family and many people around the Penn State program, and now former Attorney General and former Pennsylvania Governor Dick Thornburg, as well as others, dispute that conclusion. No one disputes that signals were missed and that more could have been done. But I think there is a legitimate dispute about the conclusions that Louis Freeh drew. Now, I'm not prepared to take a side here, but I am prepared to say that everyone is entitled to a defense. Even Jerry Sandusky was entitled to a defense. It didn't work because he was clearly and plainly and overwhelmingly guilty. But Curley, Spanier, and Schultz will have their day in court, which is why, except Spanier briefly, Curley and Schultz did not speak with Louis Freeh. And Paterno has since passed away. He can't defend himself from the grave. So to automatically accept the conclusions of the Free Report, not just the facts, but the motivations that he assigned to the people who he found primarily to be responsible for a cover-up, to automatically accept those motivations, or at least the ones he ascribed to them, is something I'm not immediately prepared to do.
But you do have to agree with this. Even you could sense that Joe Paterno, I know he's no longer here with us, so you can't ask him, but even he said he could have done more. So there had to be some kind of guilt coming from one Joe Paterno.
But saying someone could have done more is different than saying that someone knowingly covered up, knowingly enabled, knowingly put something like the football program ahead of the well-being of children who he knew were being molested and raped in some cases. Saying you could have done more to pick up on the signals and stop something in hindsight is a whole lot different than knowingly covering it up while it was going on and having full knowledge of what was going on at the time. That's what the Paterno family disputes. Now, there are two sides of this argument. Freeh has made his argument. Others have made theirs. But Paterno acknowledging that he wishes he had done more is not the same thing as Paterno agreeing with the conclusions of the Free Report, which he never lived to see.
Was the Sandusky interview that you did, was that the toughest one that you've ever had to do in your career of interviewing people?
Well, it was different. I never, and don't expect again if I'm doing this another 30 years, which I don't expect to be doing, but even if I am, I don't expect to be confronted with exactly that set of circumstances again. So, the subject matter was unsettling, but I was familiar with the grand jury report, and it seemed to me where the questioning should go. And what was surprising was the way in which he answered some of the questions. And in a situation like that, you can't be locked into a list of questions that you're going to ask one after another no matter what. You've got to listen intently and follow up on what he says and go where the conversation leads you, at least to some extent. So that's what I was trying to do.
We're talking to Bob Costas of NBC Sports as well as the MLB Network Studio 42. And Bob, let's make the transition now to some baseball. Take on this whole PED incident that's happening in South Florida with one Anthony Bosch?
Well, that will sort itself out, but it becomes clear in a general sense that over many years, ball players who have access to the finest medical care, the finest in nutrition, the finest in training, the finest in every area, seem to always find their way to some clinic that operates out of a strip mall someplace, or to somebody's second cousin in the Dominican Republic, or to somebody with a mail-order diploma tacked onto a wall someplace in Timbuktu. And it always seems that that's where they turn. And that, in general, makes you think that something illicit is going on. What I think has happened to a large extent since baseball cracked down on steroids is that the full-blown steroids like Winstrol and Decadurabolin and the sort of things that players could use with impunity in the 90s and at the turn of the century, you can't get away with that any longer. So what players are trying to do is use combinations of HGH and synthetic testosterone to get as much of a boost as they can and bring it right up to the line and not trip the test or hope, since it gets in and out of your system pretty quickly, that they're not tested immediately after taking it. The benefits stay in your system for a while, but the detectability without a blood test, and they will have a blood test for HGH beginning this year in Major League Baseball, but prior to this they did not. The detectability during the season, it's pretty quick. So a lot of these guys gambled that they could get a boost from a combination of HGH and synthetic testosterone. Nothing like the boost you get from full-blown anabolic steroids, but some kind of boost. And where do they get it? They get it from these anti-aging clinics, or they get it from people that are willing to write bogus prescriptions for them, or to be drug mules for somebody someplace. But they certainly don't get it in any legitimate fashion.
A-Rod, many years ago, people thought he was going to break Barry Bonds' home run record, which was previously held by Hank Aaron. Now that seems very distant away from that occurring at the age of 38. And even some people are questioning if A-Rod will ever play another game in a Yankees uniform. Do you see him making a return to New York? I know he's not going to be reporting down there for spring training, and he's going to rehab back in New York.
Well, even before this latest thing broke, and it's, in fairness, important to note that he denies the credibility of this. He says, his name may be in a notebook, but that he received no substances of any kind from Anthony Bosch, and he'll have a chance to defend himself in front of baseball's investigators eventually, I guess. But even before any of this latest stuff wound up in the newspapers, no one thought that A-Rod would be back until June or July at the earliest because of the hip surgery. And even if the hip surgery is fully successful, he'll be 38 this season, and so he's compromised to some extent. If he could hit 275 with 25 to 30 home runs and 85 to 95 RBIs, I think the Yankees would be very happy with that. They wouldn't be happy with the amount of money they'd have to pay to get it, but I think that that's pretty much the most that you could expect from him if he is ever able to play again.
I remember last year I was having a conversation with John Heyman, who does a phenomenal job reporting of baseball, former Sports Illustrated, now with CBS, and we were talking about guys who would get in the Hall of Fame or not. And back then, you look at A-Rod and you thought maybe he gets in the Hall of Fame because he made that whole apology for using. And you also look at a player like Barry Bonds or Roger Clemens. Those three guys, I know that we didn't see anyone get in the Hall of Fame this year, but when you look at A-Rod, Bonds, and Clemens, do you think the three of those guys eventually get into the Hall of Fame?
In A-Rod's case, it depends upon what else comes out that is credible and beyond dispute. If additional things come out that are credible and beyond dispute, and if they took place after baseball had a clear and firmly established drug policy, that might alter some voters' feelings toward A-Rod. But I think that it's possible that if A-Rod is basically cleared of this latest suspicion, that voters will put him in the same general category as Clemens and Bonds, and that general category is players who on their true merits would have been Hall of Famers without performance-enhancing drugs of any kind. And although it's obvious that a majority of the voters were not prepared to put Clemens or Bonds in on the first ballot, they each got considerably higher vote totals than McGuire ever did, than Sosa, than Palmeiro. So it's clear that at least a substantial number of voters look at them differently. And it's possible, we'll see in the next few years, but it's possible that some of those voters will say, you know what, we're going to put them in a kind of purgatory for a while. We're going to take them to the woodshed and not let them get in the first time, the second time, the third time. But eventually, we're going to concede that even had they retired in 1998, they would have been Hall of Fame quality players, so eventually we'll vote them in. Whereas we can't draw that same conclusion, let's say, about Sammy Sosa. So I could see that possibly happening with Clemens and Bonds, and I could also see it happening with A-Rod, provided that there aren't additional damning things about A-Rod that we at present don't know.
Before we let you go, as Bob Costas joins us, and it was a complete thrill to interview you today, hearing all about you at Comac High School under the direction of Mr. Patterson, and also seeing your work over the course of the years.
Counselor.
Was he
still there when you were there?
Yes, he was. We worked very closely. We did the football games and all that stuff, and he wanted me to say hello to you. But I would definitely, it would not be smart of myself if I didn't, before I let you go, if I didn't ask you this. When a kid comes up to you who wants to get into this industry, and I've been doing this stuff since I've been 8 years old, as growing up in those WFAN Astoria studios, which no longer exist under WFAN control. When a kid comes up to you and says, Bob, I want to get into this business, what kind of advice can you offer me? What do you say?
I generally say get as well-rounded an education as you possibly can, because even if you become a successful broadcaster, the better your frame of reference is, the better your sense of the world is, the better your command of language is, the better you'll be as a broadcaster. Plus, it's entirely possible that you'll change your mind along the way, you'll develop other interests, or you'll find out that even if you're a smart and dedicated person, you don't necessarily have the particular knack or the particular talent to be a first-rate broadcaster, and you may decide to go in a different direction. So putting all your eggs in one basket may not be the best idea. You get a good, well-rounded education while working on the campus radio and television stations, while taking communication classes, then you're able to go in whatever direction that your own ability and good fortune might take you.
Well, Bob, that's why you're one of the best in the business. I appreciate you coming on today, for spending a few minutes with us. Thanks so much, and don't be a stranger to this show.
All right, Zach, take care. Thanks for having me.